Imagine holding your own child in your arms, looking into their eyes, and realizing they're older than you. Not metaphorically, literally. Their wrinkles deeper than yours, their memories longer, their body decades ahead, while you remain frozen in time. It sounds impossible. It sounds like fiction. But what if we told you there are documented cases of exactly this happening? 10 people who somehow returned younger than the children they left behind. These are their stories. Imagine you're a fisherman. You've spent your entire life on the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea, battling storms that would terrify most people, hauling nets in darkness so thick you can barely see your own hands. You have a wife waiting at home, a 7-year-old son who runs to the door every evening when he hears your boots on the steps. And then one night, a storm comes that swallows you whole. You vanish. Your boat is found capsized and empty. Your body is never recovered. Your wife grieves, your son grows up without you, and the world moves on. 32 years pass. Your son becomes a man, then a father himself, then a grandfather. And then one cold morning in March, you stumble out of the fog on the same shore where you disappeared, still wearing your fishing clothes, still soaked with seawater, still exactly the age you were the night you vanished. That is precisely what happened to Erik Halvorsen, and to this day, nobody can explain it. In December of 1987, Erik Halvorsen set out from the remote Lofoten Islands in northern Norway for what should have been a routine fishing trip. He was 34 years old, experienced, respected by other fishermen in the region. The weather reports warned of an approaching storm, but Erik had weathered worse. He kissed his wife Ingrid goodbye, ruffled his son Anders' hair, and promised he would be back before morning. He never came back. The storm that hit that night was savage even by Arctic standards. Winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour, waves that could flip a vessel like a toy. When the weather cleared, search teams found Erik's boat floating upside down near a rocky outcropping. His equipment was still secured. His emergency beacon had never been activated, but Erik himself was gone. No body, no trace, nothing. The years that followed were brutal for his family. Ingrid waited for months before accepting he was dead. She eventually remarried and moved to the mainland. Anders grew up carrying the weight of a father he barely remembered. Raised by a stepfather he never fully accepted. He became a fisherman himself, as if pulled by something genetic, something unfinished. He married, had children, watched them grow. By 2019, Anders Halvorsen was 39 years old, with gray in his beard and grandchildren who called him Bestefar. His father existed only in a single photograph on his mother's old dresser, frozen forever at 34. Then, in March of 2019, something impossible happened. A man stumbled into a fishing village on the Lofoten Islands, barefoot, disoriented, wearing clothes that looked like they came from the 1980s. He was soaking wet, shivering violently, and asking for a woman by her maiden name, a name she hadn't used in over 3 decades. Local authorities assumed mental illness, or perhaps a boating accident that left him confused. But when they ran his description through missing persons databases, a match came back that made no sense. The man fit the exact description of Erik Halvorsen, missing since 1987. Anders drove 4 hours through the night to see him. When he walked into that room, his heart nearly stopped. The man sitting there looked exactly like the photograph on his mother's dresser. Same face, same build, same tiny scar on his chin from a childhood accident. Erik looked up at Anders with confusion and asked why his little boy looked so old. He kept asking where Ingrid was, why everything felt wrong, why his son had gray hair. For Erik, only minutes had passed since the storm. He remembered the waves growing impossibly tall. He remembered the sky turning a strange greenish color he had never seen before. He remembered the water going suddenly, impossibly still, and then a sound. A humming like vibrating glass filled the air before everything went white. The next thing he knew, he was lying on a rocky beach, and the world had aged without him. Some researchers believe the waters near the Lofoten Islands contain magnetic anomalies so powerful they can distort space-time itself. Others point to the aurora borealis, that dancing curtain of light, and wonder if it occasionally tears holes in reality. Erik Halvorsen now lives with his 39-year-old son, a father somehow younger than his own child. He refuses to go near the water. Sometimes Anders catches him staring at old photographs of Ingrid, weeping for a woman who died 11 years ago at 67. To Eric, she is still young. To Eric, she is still waiting. He is still 34 years old, and he will never understand where his life went. Picture this. You're 12 years old, eating breakfast with your father on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Tokyo. He's wearing his usual suit, carrying his usual briefcase, running slightly late as usual. He kisses your forehead and promises to take you to the park that weekend. You watch him walk out the door, and that's the last time you ever see him. Not because he died, not because he left, but because he stepped onto a subway train and simply ceased to exist. 26 years later, he walks out of that same station looking exactly as he did that morning, still carrying the same briefcase, still expecting to come home for dinner. But you're not 12 anymore. You're 38 years old, with children of your own. And your father hasn't aged a single day. This is the story of Kenji Yamamoto, and it remains one of the most disturbing disappearances ever recorded in Japan. On the morning of October 3rd, 1994, Kenji Yamamoto left his apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya district at exactly 7:15 a.m. He was 41 years old, a mid-level manager at an electronics company, a widower raising his daughter Yuki, alone since his wife had died during childbirth. That morning was unremarkable in every way. Kenji made Yuki's breakfast, checked her homework, and reminded her to lock the door when she left for school. At the train station, security cameras captured him buying a ticket, walking through the turnstile, and boarding the 732 Express. Hundreds of commuters saw him step into the third car from the front. The train arrived at its destination 11 minutes later with every passenger accounted for. Every passenger except Kenji Yamamoto. He had vanished somewhere between stations without anyone noticing. The investigation that followed turned up nothing. Police reviewed hours of footage from every camera on that line. They interviewed dozens of passengers who had been in the same car. No one saw Kenji exit. No one saw anything unusual at all. It was as if he had simply evaporated mid-journey. The case went cold within months. Yuki, only 12 and now completely alone, was placed with elderly grandparents who did their best to fill an unfillable void. She grew up haunted by questions that had no answers. She graduated from university, built a career, married, had 3 children of her own. She learned to live with the mystery, but she never stopped wondering. By 2020, Yuki was 38 years old and had spent more of her life without her father than with him. Then something impossible happened. During a routine maintenance closure of that same subway line, workers conducting late-night inspections discovered a man standing alone on the platform at 3 a.m. He appeared disoriented, dressed in clothing that looked decades out of style, clutching a leather briefcase. When security approached him, he asked a simple question: "What stop is this?" Then he collapsed. At the hospital, authorities found identification in his wallet, a Tokyo transit card, a business card, a driver's license, all belonging to Kenji Yamamoto, all dated 1994. The man matched every photograph in the missing persons file. He had not aged a single day. When Yuki received the call, she didn't believe it. She couldn't. She drove to the hospital expecting a mistake, a cruel coincidence, anything but the truth. But when she walked into that room, she saw her father's face exactly as she remembered it from childhood. Kenji looked at her with confusion and asked who she was. When she told him, when she said the words, "I'm Yuki, I'm your daughter," he shook his head slowly and said, that was impossible. His daughter was 12 years old. His daughter was waiting for him at home. His newspaper was still in his briefcase, dated October 3rd, 1994. His watch had stopped at 8:47 a.m., the exact moment he boarded the train. Some researchers in Japan speak of ikinoma, station gaps, places where people supposedly slip through invisible cracks in reality. They believe certain locations, built on specific geological formations or electromagnetic hotspots, can become doorways between different points in time. Kenji Yamamoto now lives in a small apartment near his daughter's home. His grandchildren call him by his first name because no one knows what else to call a grandfather who's younger than their mother. Kenji says the worst part isn't the missing years. It's that he still remembers the breakfast he made Yuki that morning. To him, it was yesterday. To her, it was a lifetime ago. Imagine you're a mother. Your baby is 3 months old, small enough to fit in the crook of your arm, new enough that his smell still makes your heart ache with tenderness. You leave him with a neighbor for just a few hours while you walk into the mountains to gather herbs, something you've done 100 times before. The morning is cool, the forest familiar, the path well worn beneath your feet. You fill your basket, turn toward home, and step through the trees into a world you no longer recognize. Your village looks different. The people dress strangely. And when you find your son, he's not an infant anymore. He's a 48-year-old man with gray hair and weathered hands, and he's staring at you like he's seen a ghost. This is what happened to Elena Bogdan, and nearly 5 decades later, no one can explain how. In the autumn of 1973, Elena Bogdan was 23 years old, living in a remote village nestled in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania near the Ukrainian border. She was known throughout the region for her knowledge of medicinal plants, a skill passed down from her grandmother. Her husband worked in a factory several hours away, returning home only on weekends. Her infant son, Mihai, was her constant companion, her greatest joy. On a crisp October morning, Elena bundled Mihai in blankets and left him with a trusted neighbor while she made her usual trip into the forest. She promised to return before noon. She carried an empty basket and wore her favorite wool shawl. She walked into the tree line and never came back. The search lasted weeks. Villagers combed every trail, every clearing, every abandoned shepherd's hut in the mountains. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of struggle or accident. The older residents whispered about the old ones in the mountains, ancient folklore about beings who lived between worlds and sometimes took people into realms where time moved differently. Elena's husband eventually remarried. Mihai was raised knowing only a single photograph of his mother's face, a young woman frozen forever at 23. He grew into a man carrying questions that had no answers. He married, had children, watched them have children of their own. By 2021, Mihai Bogdan was 48 years old, with arthritis in his hands and memories of a mother who existed only in stories. Then, in September of 2021, a group of hikers near the mountain tree line spotted something strange. A young woman wandering alone, dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum, carrying a woven basket filled with freshly picked herbs. She appeared confused, asking in an archaic dialect where her baby was, why the path looked different, who these strangers were. When authorities arrived, they took her photograph and ran it through facial recognition databases. The match that came back stopped everyone cold. The woman's face was identical to Elena Bogdan, missing since 1973. DNA testing confirmed what seemed impossible. This was Elena. She had not aged a single day. Elena remembered nothing unusual about that October morning, 48 years earlier. She recalled walking into the forest, filling her basket, and turning toward home. The light through the canopy seemed strange for a moment, thicker somehow, rippling like water. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The trees were the same, but the paths were different. The village below looked wrong, and the people she encountered spoke Romanian, but used words she didn't recognize. For Elena, perhaps 2 hours had passed. For the rest of the world, nearly half a century had vanished. Here's what makes this case even more disturbing. Elena's basket contained herbs that botanists confirmed have not grown in that region for over 30 years. Species that went extinct due to climate change and deforestation. The plants were fresh, green, as if picked that very morning. Her wool shawl showed wear consistent with only a few hours of use. By every scientific measure, Elena had been gone for no more than a single day. Elena now lives in a care facility, not because of age, but because she cannot cope with what happened. Her infant son is now a 48-year-old man who visits her weekly. He holds her hand while she weeps, unable to accept that the baby she kissed goodbye became this stranger sitting beside her. She still calls him her little one. To her, he always will be. Now imagine something even more heartbreaking. You're a father, a scientist, a man who has dedicated his life to understanding the forces that shape our planet. Your wife died bringing your twin daughters into the world, and you've raised them alone ever since, pouring every ounce of love you have into these 2 girls who are your entire universe. Then your work calls you into the wilderness for 2 weeks, and you kiss them goodbye, promising to bring back stories and souvenirs. But you never return. Your daughters grow up separated, raised by different families on opposite sides of the world. One becomes a grandmother in Seattle. The other dies of cancer in Australia, never knowing what happened to you. And then, 28 years after you vanished, you're found sitting calmly in the exact spot where you disappeared, unchanged, unaged, with no idea that your entire world has crumbled. This is the story of David Chen, and it will shatter your heart. In the summer of 1989, David Chen was a 36-year-old volcanologist working for a research university in California. His specialty was thermal anomalies, the strange heat signatures that occasionally appeared in volcanic regions without clear explanation. Yellowstone National Park, with its geysers and hot springs and the massive supervolcano sleeping beneath its surface, was his laboratory. His twin daughters, Sarah and Rachel, were 9 years old that summer, bright and curious and utterly devoted to their father. When David left for a 2-week solo expedition into Yellowstone's backcountry, he promised to call them every night from his satellite phone. He called on day 1, day 2, day 3. On day 4, the calls stopped. Rangers found his campsite abandoned, his equipment scattered as if he'd left in a hurry. His tent was still standing. His food was untouched. But David Chen was gone. The search lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles. Helicopters, dogs, thermal imaging, everything available was deployed. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of animal attack or accidental fall. David Chen had simply vanished. His daughters were separated in the aftermath, Sarah going to maternal grandparents in Seattle, Rachel to paternal relatives who later emigrated to Australia. The twins kept in touch across the distance, bound by shared loss, but their lives diverged completely. Sarah married young, had children, eventually became a grandmother. Rachel pursued medicine, worked in remote clinics, and was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2012. She died in 2014 at the age of 37, still wondering what had happened to her father. Then, in 2017, a park ranger conducting a routine survey of restricted thermal areas spotted something impossible. A man sitting calmly beside a vent in a zone where no humans were permitted, wearing hiking gear that looked 3 decades out of date. When the ranger approached, the man looked up and asked what day it was. When told it was September 2017, his face went pale and he collapsed. His identification matched David Chen's missing persons file. His appearance matched photographs from 1989 exactly. He had not aged a single day in 28 years. David's field journal was still in his pack, the pages yellowed but intact. The entries documented his research up to day 4, then contained one additional note dated 3 days later in his own handwriting. The entry described phenomena he couldn't explain, the sky changing colors in ways that didn't match any atmospheric event, the ground vibrating with frequencies he could feel in his bones, a sound like singing coming from deep underground. The final sentence was incomplete, cut off mid-word, as if he'd been interrupted by something sudden. Some researchers believe Yellowstone's geothermal activity creates unstable pockets where space-time itself becomes unreliable. The specific vent where David was found contains unusual concentrations of iridium, an element commonly found in meteorites, material some theorists believe carries temporal properties from deep space. David learned of Rachel's death 3 years after it happened. She was 37, the same age he still appeared to be. He never saw her grow up, never held her hand through chemotherapy, never said goodbye. Sarah flew to meet him immediately, now 37 herself, older than her father would ever be. David keeps a photograph of both girls at age 9 on his nightstand. He says that's how he still sees them. That's how they'll always be. His little girls, frozen in time, just like him. Now, try to wrap your mind around something that sounds completely impossible. You're 8 months pregnant, days away from holding your child for the first time. You can feel the baby moving inside you, kicking against your ribs, already so alive and so loved. You go for a morning walk along the coastal path near your home, the fog rolling in from the sea, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. And then something happens. You don't know what. The fog thickens, the light shifts, and suddenly you're somewhere else. Somewhere that looks the same, but feels entirely wrong. You're still pregnant. Your baby is still kicking, but somehow, impossibly, that same baby has already been born, has already lived an entire life, has already grown old and died. The child in your womb and the woman in the grave are the same person. This is the story of Margaret Ashworth, and it breaks every rule of time we thought we understood. In March of 1981, Margaret Ashworth was 28 years old and living in a small seaside town in Cornwall, England. Her husband Thomas worked as a lighthouse keeper on a nearby island, coming home every few weeks for brief visits. Margaret was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they had already decided to name Emily. On a foggy Tuesday morning, Margaret set out for her usual walk along the coastal path, a route she had taken hundreds of times before. She told a neighbor she would be back within the hour. She never returned. Search parties combed the cliffs and beaches for weeks. The Coast Guard found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of a fall or accident. Margaret Ashworth had simply vanished into the fog. But here's where the story becomes truly impossible. 3 days after Margaret disappeared, a newborn baby was found on the doorstep of the local hospital. A healthy girl, wrapped in a blanket that no one recognized, with a small heart-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder. The same birthmark that had appeared on Margaret's ultrasound images just weeks before. DNA testing years later confirmed what seemed unthinkable. This baby was Margaret's daughter, the child she had been carrying when she vanished. Somehow, the baby had been born and delivered to that hospital doorstep, while Margaret herself remained missing. The child was named Emily by the nurses who found her. She grew up in foster care, never knowing where she came from or who her parents were. She lived a full and ordinary life. She married, had children of her own, became a grandmother, and in 2019, at the age of 38, Emily died of heart failure, still wondering about the mother she had never known. 4 years later, in 2023, Margaret Ashworth stumbled out of the fog on that same coastal path, still 8 months pregnant, still 28 years old, still expecting to return home within the hour. For Margaret, perhaps 30 minutes had passed. For the rest of the world, 42 years had vanished. Margaret was rushed to the hospital in labor. Doctors performed an emergency delivery, and she gave birth to a healthy baby girl with a small heart-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder. DNA testing confirmed the impossible. This child was genetically identical to Emily, not a sibling, not a relative, the exact same person. The same child, born twice, separated by more than 4 decades. One version had already lived an entire life and died. The other was taking her first breaths in a hospital room, while her mother wept with confusion and joy. Some physicists speak of temporal bifurcation, the theoretical possibility that a single moment can split, sending different versions of the same matter along different paths through time. Margaret went one direction. Her unborn child somehow went another. They were separated by forces we cannot measure or explain, reunited only by Margaret's impossible return. Margaret is now raising an infant who is, in every biological sense, the same person as a woman who already lived a complete life and died 4 years ago. Emily's children have visited. They've held their grandmother's baby sister, their mother's impossible twin. No one knows what to call this relationship. No one knows what any of it means. Margaret says the hardest part is looking at her daughter and seeing the ghost of everything her child has already become. Picture yourself behind the controls of a small aircraft, climbing into the Nevada sky as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon. You're a pilot, experienced and confident, taking a short evening flight while your 6-year-old daughter stays with her grandmother back home. The desert stretches beneath you in shades of orange and red, beautiful and endless. Then, a storm appears from nowhere, dark clouds swirling in patterns you've never seen before. You fly into it because there's no way around. The sky changes color, your instruments spin wildly, and when you emerge on the other side, you're no longer in 1997, you're in 1952. You spend the next 41 years living in the past, aging, waiting, searching for a way home. And when you finally find it, when you finally land back at that same airfield, only 4 hours have passed. Your daughter has aged 4 hours. You have aged 4 decades. This is the story of Marcus Webb, and it proves that time doesn't move the same way for everyone. In September of 1997, Marcus Webb was 32 years old, a recreational pilot and single father living in a small town outside Las Vegas. His daughter Taylor was 6, a bright and curious child who loved watching her father's plane take off and disappear into the sky. On that particular evening, Marcus left Taylor with her grandmother and headed to a local airfield for a short sunset flight, a routine trip he'd made dozens of times before. The weather was clear when he took off. Radar tracked him heading northeast toward the mountains. Then, approximately 40 minutes into the flight, controllers watched his signal enter an unexpected storm cell that had appeared from nowhere. Moments later, his transponder vanished from their screens. 4 hours later, an aircraft matching Marcus's description radioed the tower requesting permission to land. The plane touched down smoothly, taxiing to the same spot where it had departed. But the man who climbed out of the cockpit was not the 32-year-old who had left. He was elderly, somewhere in his 70s, with deep lines carved into his face and hands spotted with age. He wore the same flight suit Marcus had been wearing, now faded and patched in places. He identified himself as Marcus Webb and immediately asked for his daughter Taylor. What Marcus told investigators defied everything they understood about reality. After entering the storm, he said the sky turned a deep violet color he had never seen before. His instruments went haywire, the engine sputtered, and then suddenly he was through, emerging into clear skies over a landscape that looked subtly wrong. The roads below were different, the buildings were different. When he landed at the nearest airfield, confused and disoriented, he discovered the impossible truth. The year was 1952. He had somehow flown 45 years into the past. Marcus spent the next 4 decades living in an era that wasn't his own. He worked as a mechanic under a false identity, never quite aging at the rate he should have, always searching for another storm, like the one that had brought him there. He watched history unfold, knowing what was coming, unable to change it, unable to tell anyone the truth. In 1993, he finally detected atmospheric conditions that matched what he'd experienced in 1997. He took off into that storm and prayed. When he emerged, he was back. Only 4 hours had passed for everyone else. Marcus brought proof of his journey, photographs of himself across 5 decades, aging slowly but visibly, documents notarized years apart by officials long dead, and most remarkably, a letter addressed to Taylor that he had written in 1960, sealed by a notary who passed away in 1973. The letter contained details only Marcus could know: Taylor's first word, her favorite stuffed animal, the lullaby he sang her every night. He had carried that letter for 37 years, waiting for the chance to deliver it. Marcus spent 5 years reconnecting with Taylor, a 10-year-old girl suddenly being raised by a father in his 70s, who had lived nearly half a century longer than she had existed. He died in 2002 at the age of 78. Taylor is now 32, the same age her father was when he left for that sunset flight. She still has the letter. She reads it every year on the anniversary, touching handwriting that never changed even across 40 years. She says that's how she knows he really loved her. He stayed the same inside, even as time tried to tear them apart. Imagine being part of a secret mission, handpicked by your government to investigate something they don't fully understand. You're a scientist, a specialist in forces most people have never heard of, and you've been sent into one of the most remote regions on Earth to study anomalies that defy explanation. Your son is 4 years old, waiting at home with your wife, too young to understand where you've gone or why. You promise yourself you'll be back soon, but something happens in that frozen wilderness, something that swallows you and your entire team without a trace. And when you finally emerge, still young, still wearing your Soviet-era equipment, 47 years have passed. Your son is 51 years old now. He's dying of cancer. And you reach his bedside with only 3 days left. This is the story of Alexei Volkov, and it's one of the most devastating time displacement cases ever recorded. In the summer of 1968, the Soviet government assembled a classified expedition of 12 scientists and military personnel. Their mission was to investigate persistent magnetic anomalies detected near the Tunguska impact site, the remote Siberian location where a mysterious explosion had flattened over 800 square miles of forest in 1908. The cause of that explosion has never been definitively explained. Some say it was a meteorite. Others believe it was something far stranger. Alexei Volkov, a 34-year-old geophysicist specializing in electromagnetic phenomena, was selected to lead the scientific team. He left his wife and 4-year-old son, Dmitry, in Moscow, promising to return within 6 weeks. The expedition entered the taiga in July. By September, all contact had ceased. Search parties found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no sign that 12 people had ever been there at all. The Soviet government classified the entire incident and buried the files. Dmitry Volkov grew up knowing only that his father had disappeared on a research mission. His mother remarried eventually, though she never stopped wondering. Dmitry became an engineer, married, had children of his own. In 2012, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lung cancer. By 2015, doctors told him he had months to live. He was 51 years old, and he had spent his entire life carrying questions about a father who existed only in a handful of photographs. Then in the autumn of 2015, a forestry survey team working deep in the Siberian wilderness made an impossible discovery. A man walking alone through dense taiga, dressed in equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, speaking Russian with an accent that hadn't been common since the Soviet era. His gear bore serial numbers matching items issued in 1968. His identification papers were nearly 50 years old, but looked almost new. He identified himself as Alexei Volkov and asked what year it was. When told it was 2015, he sat down in the snow and wept. Alexei's account of what happened to the expedition is fragmentary and disturbing. He described the team encountering a zone where their compasses spun uselessly and electronic equipment failed completely. The air felt thick, charged with something that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Then they entered a field of light, a shimmering barrier that seemed to exist between the trees. One by one, the team members walked into it. Alexei was the last. When he emerged on the other side, believing only hours had passed, he was alone. The others were gone. He wandered for what felt like days, trying to find his way back to base camp. He never found it. He never found anything except empty forest and silence. Alexei's journals survived, carried in his pack for what had been his version of a few days. The final entries, written by other team members before the event, describe increasingly strange phenomena, time appearing to loop, team members seeing themselves in the distance. The last note, in Alexei's handwriting, reads simply, "The others are gone. I can see all of time at once. I don't know how to come back." Alexei reached Dmitry's hospital room on a Tuesday in November. His son was frail, barely able to speak, connected to machines that beeped softly in the quiet room. They held hands for 3 days without letting go. Dmitry died on Friday, finally having seen his father's face after a lifetime of wondering. Alexei, still 34 years old, buried his 51-year-old son the following week. At the funeral, he stood completely alone. His wife had died in 1989. Everyone he had ever known was either dead or elderly. He was a young man trapped in a world where his entire life had already happened without him. Think about the happiest moments of your childhood, the birthdays, the celebrations, the days when everything felt magical and safe. Now imagine being the one who created that magic for your child. You're a mother standing in your kitchen, lifting a birthday cake decorated with pink frosting and 5 small candles. Your daughter is in the garden with her friends, waiting, excited, counting down the seconds until you walk through that door. You pick up the cake, turn toward the sunlight streaming through the window, and take a single step. But that step doesn't lead to the garden. It leads to somewhere else, somewhere 45 years away. When you finally walk through that same door, your daughter isn't 5 anymore. She's 50. Her hair is gray. Her face is lined with decades you never witnessed. And you're still holding the cake. This is the story of Isabelle Durand, and it proves that sometimes a single moment can swallow an entire lifetime. On June 14, 1979, Isabelle Durand was celebrating her daughter Camille's 5th birthday at their family home in rural Provence, France. The garden was filled with children, balloons tied to chairs, streamers fluttering in the warm summer breeze. Isabelle had spent the entire morning preparing, baking the cake herself, decorating it with Camille's favorite colors. The party was perfect. The laughter was loud and joyful, and when it came time for the cake, Isabelle walked into the kitchen to retrieve it, promising she would be right back. She picked up the cake, turned toward the door, and noticed something strange. The light coming through the window seemed different somehow, too bright, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, she was walking through the same door into the same garden. But everything had changed. The children were gone. The balloons were gone. The streamers had been replaced by different decorations, more elegant, more adult. and the people gathered in the garden were strangers, except for one. A woman standing at the center of the group, gray-haired and elegant, staring at Isabel with an expression of absolute shock. That woman was Camille. She was turning 50 years old, and her mother had just walked out of the kitchen carrying a cake decorated for a 5th birthday, looking exactly as she had 45 years earlier. The guests at Camille's 50th birthday party would later describe the moment as impossible to comprehend. A young woman in 1970s, clothing emerging from the house, holding a cake that clearly didn't belong, asking where everyone had gone, why the garden looked different, where her little girl was. Isabel was confused, frightened, unable to process what she was seeing. She kept asking for 5-year-old Camille, kept looking around for the children who should have been there. It took hours for her to begin accepting the truth. She had walked through a door and lost 45 years. Scientists who have studied the case speak of something called anniversary loops, theoretical weak points in time that form around moments of intense emotional significance. Birthdays, weddings, moments of profound joy or grief. These events, some researchers believe, create impressions in the fabric of space-time, echoes that can occasionally reconnect across decades. June 14, 1979, and June 14, 2024. The same date, the same location, the same powerful emotions. Perhaps the universe itself remembered, and for one impossible moment, those 2 points touched. The birthday cake was tested by researchers fascinated by the case. The ingredients were consistent with products available only in the 1970s, specific artificial colors and preservatives that were banned decades ago. A wheat strain that hasn't been commercially grown since the 1980s. The candles were manufactured by a company that went out of business in 1983. By every measurable standard, that cake had been baked 45 years ago. But it was fresh, moist, as if it had come out of the oven that morning. Isabel now lives with Camille, a 50-year-old woman caring for a mother 20 years younger than herself. Camille's children, Isabel's grandchildren, are older than Isabel. At family gatherings, she sometimes forgets. She'll ask Camille to go play outside, then catch herself, the words dying in her throat. She missed everything: the first day of school, the graduation, the wedding, the grandchildren being born. She was only gone for the time it takes to carry a cake across a room. But that room took 45 years. Now imagine something that goes beyond heartbreaking into truly terrifying. You're a father of 3, a hard-working man who loves his family more than anything in the world. Your children are 8, 6, and 4 years old. You kiss them goodbye one ordinary Tuesday morning, climb into your car, and drive toward a meeting in another city. You never arrive. Your car is found abandoned on the highway, engine still running, door hanging open. No sign of struggle, no explanation. You simply vanished. But here's what makes this case different from all the others. When you finally return, 56 years later, unchanged and confused, your children are in their 60s, and they don't remember you at all. Not your face, not your voice, not even your name. It's as if you never existed. This is the story of Robert Collins, and it suggests something about time travel that is deeply, profoundly disturbing. In October of 1962, Robert Collins was 36 years old, living with his wife Dorothy and their 3 children in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. James was 8, Linda was 6, and Peter was 4. Robert worked as a traveling salesman, spending long hours on the road, but always returning home with small gifts and stories that made his children laugh. On that particular Tuesday, he left before sunrise for a meeting 3 hours away, promising to be home for dinner. He never made it. His car was discovered later that afternoon, on a stretch of highway outside of town, engine idling, driver's door standing open as if he had stepped out for just a moment. His briefcase was on the passenger seat. His coffee was still warm, but Robert Collins was gone. The investigation found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play, no explanation whatsoever. Dorothy waited for years before finally accepting he wasn't coming back. She raised the children alone, eventually remarried, and built a new life. James, Linda, and Peter grew up, went to college, started families of their own. They became grandparents, and in all that time, they carried the mystery of their father's disappearance like a weight they could never quite set down. Then, in 2018, A highway patrol officer responded to a report of a confused man walking along the same stretch of road where Robert's car had been found 56 years earlier. The man was disoriented, wearing clothing that looked decades out of style, asking passing cars for directions to a meeting that had been scheduled for October 1962. He carried a briefcase, a wallet with outdated identification, and a driver's license bearing the name Robert Collins. His appearance matched the missing person's photographs exactly. He had not aged a single day. When authorities contacted his children, now James at 64, Linda at 62, and Peter at 60, they expected an emotional reunion. What they got instead was confusion. None of the children remembered their father, not his face, not his name, not his existence. They remembered growing up with only their mother. Family photographs showed Dorothy with 4 children, not 3, and no trace of Robert anywhere. Dorothy's journals, preserved after her death in 2003, never mentioned a husband. It was as if Robert Collins had been erased from their lives completely. Some physicists theorize about something called temporal erasure, the idea that when someone is significantly displaced in time, the timeline might heal around their absence. Memories change, evidence shifts, reality rewrites itself to fill the gap. If this theory is true, then Robert didn't just lose 56 years. He lost his entire existence in the lives of everyone he loved. Robert's briefcase contained family photographs, showing him with Dorothy and the 3 children, smiling in a garden that his children don't recognize. The house in the pictures has different colored shutters than they remember. The car in the driveway is a model they've never seen. Small details, but wrong. Robert came back to a timeline that wasn't quite his own. He lives alone now in a small apartment across town. His children acknowledge the DNA evidence. They accept, intellectually, that he is their biological father. But they feel nothing for him. No recognition, no connection, no sense of loss recovered. Robert remembers everything. James's first steps, Linda's first word, Peter's infectious laugh. He remembers a family that loved him, a life that mattered. But that family exists now only in photographs from a world that somehow no longer exists. He returned home to find that home had forgotten him completely. Now, picture the most impossible reversal of all. You're 3 years old, standing at the window of your family's small farmhouse in rural Poland, watching your father walk into a snowstorm. He's going to find the cow that escaped from the barn, a simple task he's done many times before. He turns back once to wave at you, snowflakes catching in his dark hair, and then he disappears into the white. He never comes back. You grow up without him, carrying only fragments of memory and a single photograph of his face. You become a woman, then a mother, then a grandmother. You grow old wondering what happened to him, and you make peace with never knowing. Then one day, when you're 68 years old with white hair and weathered hands, you receive a phone call. They've found your father, he's still young, he's still lost, and he's still looking for his little girl. This is the story of Anna and Tadeusz Kowalski, and it is perhaps the most heartbreaking case of time displacement ever recorded. In the winter of 1954, the village where the Kowalski family lived was buried under one of the heaviest snowfalls in decades. Tadeusz Kowalski was 28 years old, a farmer with strong hands and a gentle voice, devoted to his wife and his 3-year-old daughter, Anna. When their cow broke through a fence and wandered into the storm, Tadeusz didn't hesitate. He pulled on his coat, kissed Anna's forehead, and promised he would be right back. He walked out the door and into the blinding white. The storm raged for 3 more days. When it finally cleared, search parties found the cow frozen near a tree line. But Tadeusz was gone. No body, no footprints, no sign that he had ever reached the animal at all. The village mourned. His wife eventually remarried, and little Anna grew up with nothing but a wooden doll her father had carved for her, clutched in her hands the morning he disappeared. The decades that followed were ordinary in their sadness. Anna married, had children, buried her mother, became a grandmother herself. She moved to Krakow for better opportunities, but returned to her home village every year to visit her father's empty grave, a marker placed by a family that never stopped hoping. By 2019, Anna was 68 years old, her hair silver, her joints aching. Her memories of her father faded to almost nothing. She had accepted long ago that she would never know what happened to him. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Authorities in her home village had found a young man wandering in a field near the old Kowalski farm, disoriented and frightened, dressed in clothing from the 1950s. He was asking for his daughter. He was asking for his wife. He identified himself as Tadeusz Kowalski. And when Anna saw his photograph, sent to her phone by a bewildered police officer, her heart nearly stopped. It was her father's face. The same face from the photograph she had kept for 65 years. He had not aged a single day. Anna traveled to meet him, her hands trembling the entire journey. When she walked into the room where he was being held, she saw the face from her earliest memories, the face she had spent a lifetime trying not to forget. Tadeusz looked up at her and asked where his little girl was. Anna, weeping, told him the truth. She was his little girl. He didn't believe her. How could this elderly woman be the 3-year-old he had kissed goodbye just hours ago? Tadeusz carried something in his pocket that day, a small wooden doll he had carved for Anna, freshly made, still smelling of pine. He was bringing it home to her when he vanished. Anna reached into her purse and pulled out her own version of that same doll, worn smooth by 65 years of holding. The paint faded, the features softened by time. They placed them side by side, same tool marks, same tiny crack in the base, the same object, separated by more than 6 decades. Anna took her father home with her. For 4 years she cared for him, cooking his meals, helping him understand a world that had left him behind. A daughter raising her father. In 2023, Anna died of heart failure at 72. Tadeusz was at her bedside, holding her hand, watching his little girl take her final breath. He buried his daughter the following week. He visits her grave every Sunday. He still carries the wooden doll. He says he's waiting for the snow to return, hoping it might take him somewhere he can find her young again. 10 people, 10 impossible returns. Children who became grandparents while their parents stayed frozen. Families reunited across chasms of decades, only to find themselves strangers. What does it mean when time breaks its own rules? Are these glitches in reality, or glimpses of something we were never meant to understand? One thing is certain. Somewhere, right now, someone is walking into a storm, a forest, a subway car, and they may not come back the same, or at all.